I had been planning this trip for months. After a grueling year of work at a small tech startup in Denver, I was desperate for isolation. My name is Marcus, I'm 32, and in November of 2019, I rented a small cabin deep in the White River National Forest in Colorado. The listing had promised complete solitude, a chance to escape the noise, and honestly, that was exactly what I wanted. I drove up alone, my old Subaru packed with firewood, canned food, and a stack of books I didn't expect to touch. The first few hours were serene. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional caw of a crow or the distant crunch of deer through fallen leaves. The cabin itself was older than I imagined, built from thick logs and a dark, weathered pine roof. It sat at the end of a gravel trail, at least 2 miles from the nearest road, surrounded by trees that blocked most of the late afternoon light. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, which at first I found refreshing. I spent the first evening unpacking, stacking firewood neatly next to the stone fireplace, and lighting a small wood stove in the corner. The heater worked fine, but I wanted the fire anyway. There was a faint draft from the windows, but nothing concerning. By 10 o'clock, the forest outside was pitch black, the cabin lit only by firelight. I had my laptop on hand to write, but soon I let it sit closed. I wanted silence. It was around midnight when I first noticed something odd. I woke to the sound of heavy breathing outside the cabin. My heart jumped. I lay in the bed, straining to listen. The sound wasn't constant, but it came in bursts, like someone or something was pacing just beyond the tree line. I told myself it was the wind or an animal, but there was a rhythm to it, deliberate, measured. My rational mind argued, a bear, a large dog, or maybe even a mountain lion. I gripped the baseball bat I kept under the bed, reminding myself that I wasn't helpless. Morning brought no relief. Sunlight filtered weakly through the clouds, and the forest looked deceptively calm. I ventured outside, walking the perimeter of the cabin. I noticed broken twigs, flattened grass, and faint footprints in the damp soil, not human. Too large and uneven to match my boots, but definitely not deer or elk. My stomach turned. I went back inside, locked the doors, and tried to focus on mundane tasks. Chopping firewood, boiling water, making coffee. The second night was worse. The noises returned, closer this time, circling the cabin. Scratches against the wood siding, heavy thuds, then silence. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake until dawn, listening to the forest breathe around me, feeling every shadow as if it might move. I considered leaving, but the nearest town was over an hour away, and the roads were rough. I wasn't sure I could drive out safely without risking getting stuck in mud or snow. So I stayed. I tried to rationalize. I must be imagining things, overreacting in isolation. But the more I tried to reason, the more real it felt. By the third day, my nerves were frayed. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. On the fourth night, I woke to the sound of my front door handle rattling. My stomach dropped, adrenaline spiking. I gripped the bat and moved silently to the door. Whoever or whatever was out there was testing the cabin. I held my breath and waited. After several long minutes, the sound stopped. I dared not look outside. I realized something then. I wasn't alone. Someone or some people had been observing me. They had known when I arrived. They had circled the cabin, and they were testing my boundaries. My mind raced through every scenario. Robbery, trap, confrontation. I felt completely exposed, despite the solid walls around me. The night that followed was the longest of my life. I kept the fire roaring, all lights on, and stayed awake, clutching my bat. The noises came in waves. Shuffling feet, whispers of movement, faint laughter even. Impossibly quiet yet clear in the stillness. I could hear a branch snap maybe 10 feet from the window. I kept telling myself to stay calm, but I had never felt more vulnerable. Morning brought a strange silence. The cabin and forest were still, almost painfully so. I stepped outside cautiously, bat in hand. That's when I saw them. Footprints, definitely human, circling the cabin like a path. There were at least 2 sets, both large, heavy, and uneven. but they stopped at the edge of the tree line and vanished. No one had come closer. I stayed another day, documenting the footprints, inspecting the cabin, and making sure I had an escape route. By the afternoon, I decided it was enough. I packed quickly, leaving the cabin as it was, but I didn't look back. The drive down the gravel trail felt endless, every crunch of tires over rocks echoing in my mind. When I reached the nearest town, I called the local ranger station and reported the incident. They listened, took notes, but told me the area was remote and occasionally used by illegal hunters or vandals. They couldn't guarantee anything. I never went back to that cabin. Months later, I learned through online forums that cabins in that region are often used by people living off the grid illegally. Trespassers are known to test anyone who stays alone, sometimes to intimidate, sometimes just for sport. I realized that I had stumbled into one of these territories unknowingly. I had survived because I stayed aware, calm, and didn't provoke them. Looking back, the fear was intense, but the relief was greater. I learned to respect isolation, to plan better, and most importantly, to never underestimate the presence of other humans in places that seem empty. That cabin taught me a lesson in vigilance I would never forget. I never planned to spend a night alone in that cabin. It happened because I needed a break from everything. In early November of 2019, after weeks of stress, I rented a small wooden cabin in the northern woods of Montana. I was 26 at the time, tired from work, tired from people, tired from noise. The listing said the cabin was quiet, simple, and far from the nearest town. That sounded perfect. I told myself I just needed 2 nights of silence to reset my mind. When I got there, the place looked older than the photos. The boards on the outside walls had dark stains from years of rain and snow. The porch steps bent a little under my weight, and the windows had scratches like someone had dragged something sharp across the glass. But the door unlocked fine, and the inside smelled of pine and cold air, so I decided not to worry about small details. The cabin had one room with a small kitchen on one side, a bed against the wall, a desk, and a wood stove. Everything felt tight, like the whole room had been built slightly smaller than it should have been. The silence outside was heavy. I remember standing in the doorway for a few seconds, trying to get used to the feeling of being somewhere so far from people. The nearest road was more than a mile away, and the trees were thick enough that I couldn't see the sky unless I stepped into the clearing. I spent the afternoon walking around the area. The air felt colder than normal for that time of year. The woods looked the same in every direction: tall trees, rough bark, piles of dead leaves, and no real landmarks. I kept telling myself to stay close to the cabin because it was too easy to get lost. The ground was covered with old footprints. Not mine. Some were small, maybe animals, but some were long, almost the size of my own boots. They were half erased by rain and mud, so I couldn't tell how old they were. As the sun dropped, the cold began creeping in fast. I went back to the cabin, locked the door even though I knew no one should be out there, and lit the wood stove. The heat made the room feel safer, but the silence didn't go away. It felt thick, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Around 8 p.m., I started hearing soft noises outside. Not footsteps, just small cracks, like branches snapping from weight. I tried to ignore them. Forests make sounds all the time, but the cracks kept happening every few minutes. Sometimes they were close, sometimes farther back. I told myself it was an animal passing through, maybe a deer. Still, every sound made my heartbeat jump a little. By 10 p.m., the fire was dying down, so I added more wood. When I bent down to pick up another log, I noticed something through the window, something faint, a small reflection. For a second I thought it was the firelight, but it wasn't. It was higher, almost level with the window itself. It disappeared the moment I moved. I stood still, waiting to see if I had imagined it. Nothing happened for a long time. The only sound came from the fire. I convinced myself it was snow catching the light, even though it wasn't snowing. I decided to go to bed, though my body didn't feel tired anymore. I lay under the blanket with my clothes still on because the cold was settling deep into the room. The cabin didn't have electricity, so the only light came from the stove's orange glow. I closed my eyes, hoping to fall asleep fast. But around midnight, I woke up without knowing why. The fire was low again, but there was still enough light to see the shapes of the room. The air felt wrong. Not colder, just heavier, like the pressure had changed. Then I heard something outside the cabin, directly behind the wall near the bed. A slow scraping sound. Something dragging across the wood. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. The scrape happened again. Very slow, very controlled. Like someone dragging their fingers across the wall, but using something harder, maybe metal or stone. I counted the seconds in my head. The sound lasted 3 seconds each time. Then silence. Then it happened again. I wanted to believe it was a branch. Maybe the wind pushed it. Maybe it was nothing dangerous. But there was no wind, and the scraping moved not side to side, but down, lower, closer to the ground. Then it stopped completely. I sat up in the bed and kept my eyes on the window. That was when I saw movement outside. Not a clear shape, just a shadow shifting, blocking a bit of the faint moonlight that slipped through the trees. It stayed there for a few seconds, then moved out of sight again. I felt a cold rush run up my spine. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to go outside, and I didn't want to stay still either. I kept staring at the window, waiting for something else to move. Minutes passed. Then I heard the porch steps. One creak, then another, slower this time, as if someone was carefully testing the wood. I wanted to reach for something to defend myself with, but the closest thing was a metal fire poker near the stove. I would have to cross the room to get it. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps were quiet but steady. Then they stopped right near the door. I could hear my own heartbeat louder than anything else in the world at that moment. The doorknob didn't turn. Nothing hit the door. No sound at all. The silence was worse than the noises. I sat there, staring at the door from the bed, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like an hour but was probably only a few minutes, the creak of the porch steps came again, moving away this time. One step, then another, then nothing. I didn't sleep at all after that. I stayed sitting up in the bed until the first gray light of morning came through the window. When I finally felt safe enough to move, I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was 6:14 a.m. I packed my things in less than 2 minutes. Before leaving, I forced myself to look outside. I opened the door slowly. The cold morning air hit me sharp. The porch steps had fresh marks, muddy prints, not animal prints and not mine. Longer, wider. Someone had stood there in the night. When I walked around the side of the cabin, I saw the wall near the bed. The wood had long, deep scratches. Not from claws, lines, thin, clean, like they were made by a knife or some tool. They ran from shoulder height down to the ground. Whoever had been out there wasn't lost. They weren't wandering. They were watching. I left the cabin without looking back. I walked the whole mile down the trail fast, almost running, and didn't stop until I reached my car. The whole drive back to town, I kept checking the mirror even though I knew no one was following me. I never reported it. I didn't want to explain something I couldn't fully understand myself. But since that night, I haven't gone anywhere alone in the woods again. Sometimes, when I'm half asleep, I still hear that slow scraping sound in my head, the steady, patient way it moved down the wall, and I know it wasn't my imagination. The worst part is knowing someone was out there, in the cold dark, standing just inches from where I slept, not trying to break in, not trying to talk, just standing there, watching me through the window, and whatever they wanted, they were patient enough to come close without making a sound, until they wanted me to hear them. I drove up to the cabin in late October of 2019, when the afternoons were short and the sun dropped fast behind the hills. I was 31 then, tired from months of non-stop work, and I wanted a place where I could shut off my phone, breathe fresh air, and stop hearing the noise of the city. A coworker had told me about this small cabin his uncle owned in northern Wyoming, a few miles away from the nearest town. He said the place was old but safe, quiet, and surrounded by tall pines. That sounded perfect. I didn't want people. I didn't want traffic. I wanted silence. The drive up the long dirt road felt peaceful at first. The ground was covered in dry leaves that spun around behind my car. The air was cold but clean. The cabin sat in a small clearing, its wood faded from years of sun and snow. The porch leaned a little on the right side, like it was tired of holding itself up. The place didn't look dangerous or strange. It looked lonely. That was what I wanted. Inside, everything smelled like old wood and dust. The cabin had one small bedroom, a tiny kitchen with a rusty sink, and a living area with a wood stove. There was a single window facing the trees. I dropped my bag on the old sofa and opened the window to let out the stale air. The wind blew in a faint smell of pine and dirt. Felt calming. The first evening passed quietly. I walked around the clearing, listened to the wind moving through the branches, and watched the sky turn deep blue. By the time I returned inside, the air had dropped to near freezing. I started a fire in the stove and sat close to it, letting the heat soak into my skin. I felt the stress of the last few months start to melt. I didn't bother turning on the radio. I liked hearing nothing but the crackling fire. I went to bed early that night, expecting to sleep well. Instead, I woke up around 2 a.m. for no clear reason. My eyes opened fast, like something had snapped me out of sleep. The cabin was completely dark. The fire had died, and the air felt colder. My heartbeat was steady at first, then began to pick up. I didn't hear anything outside or inside, but something felt off, like the darkness had weight to it. I lay still for a long time, trying to figure out why I felt uneasy. My mind kept searching for a sound, a branch breaking, an animal moving. Anything but the night stayed silent. Eventually, I forced myself to take slow breaths until sleep came back. The next morning, frost covered the grass. I stepped outside with a cup of instant coffee and looked around the clearing. Everything seemed normal, but something kept pulling my eyes to the tree line. The trees were tall and thick, almost too close together. There was no trail, no fence, nothing marking where the property ended. Just endless trees. While drinking my coffee, I noticed tracks in the dirt near the porch. They weren't from my car, and they weren't round like deer prints. These were footprints, human footprints, but the shape looked strange. The toes were deep, pressed hard into the soil, like the person wasn't wearing shoes. The prints led from the edge of the clearing toward the porch, then turned around sharply and disappeared back into the woods. My first thought was that someone from the town must have wandered through, maybe a hunter or a hiker, but that didn't explain the barefoot shape. The weather was too cold for anyone to be walking barefoot out there. The prints also looked fresh. I crouched down and touched the dirt. It was still soft from last night's cold moisture. Whoever made those prints had been there while I was asleep. I tried to shrug it off. People did strange things in rural areas sometimes. Maybe someone was camping nearby. Maybe it was nothing. I spent that day chopping wood behind the cabin, cleaning the kitchen, and trying to settle into the calm I came for. But every so often, I caught myself looking toward the trees again. Felt like something was out there, not watching me exactly, but aware of me. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in, heavy and low, blocking the sun. The air felt colder than the day before. I went inside to start another fire, and as I placed the logs in the stove, I heard something from outside, not loud, not sharp, but real. It was the soft sound of something stepping on dry leaves. One step, then another. Slow, careful. I froze, listening so hard my ears hurt. The steps stopped. Everything went silent again, the way it does right before snow. I waited a long time before I moved again. When night came, I kept the fire going longer. I pushed a small table against the main door, not because I was scared, but because it made me feel more in control. I crawled into bed fully dressed, coat on top of the blanket, boots near my feet. I told myself I was overreacting. I didn't sleep much. Every time the wind shook a branch, I tensed. Every time the stove cracked, I opened my eyes. At around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The steps, but this time closer, near the window. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was walking in a half circle around the cabin. The window was too dark for me to see anything. I didn't dare move. I didn't even breathe deeply. Then the steps stopped on the porch. The old wood creaked under the weight of something. Not an animal. Too heavy. The boards groaned once, then twice, then nothing. I lay there for what felt like hours until the sun finally came up. The moment I saw light through the window, I got out of bed, grabbed my bag, and went outside. There were new footprints on the porch, barefoot again. The dirt and frost had captured them clearly. They were longer than mine, and the toes dug deep, like the person stood there for a long time before leaving. I didn't pack up the cabin properly. I didn't clean up or write a note. I threw my things into the car and started the engine with shaking hands. I backed out of the clearing so fast the wheels spun on the frost. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept checking the mirror. The trees swayed in the wind, but nothing moved between them. Still, I didn't slow down. I didn't feel safe until I reached the highway and saw the open sky. I never asked my coworker about the footprints. I never told him what happened. I just said the cabin was fine and thanked him. But the image of those prints stayed in my mind, the barefoot shape, the deep pressure, the way they circled the cabin like someone was studying it. I've thought a lot about what happened. I know it wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. It was something real. Someone real. Someone out there in the cold woods, walking barefoot, moving around silently in the dark, coming close enough to stand on the porch in the middle of the night. Someone who didn't try to break in, didn't try to talk, didn't leave a note or a sign. Someone who just watched. And that, to me, is worse than any ghost. I never went back to that cabin. I never will. I drove up to the mountains in late October of 2019, thinking the cold air and quiet space would help me clear my head after months of stressful work. I rented a small wooden cabin in northern Colorado, about 40 minutes away from the nearest town. The place stood on a slope covered with tall pine trees. The trees were so close and dense that they looked like a dark wall pressing in on the cabin. The owner had told me the cabin was old but steady, with a metal roof that made loud sounds when the wind hit it. I didn't care. I wanted silence, clean air, and no people. The road up was rough and narrow. The gravel kept popping under my tires, and the wind kept blowing thin dust over the car. It was late afternoon by the time I reached the cabin. The place looked smaller in person, almost too quiet, with a wide porch and a single step that creaked when I put my weight on it. The area around it felt empty. No other cabins, no hikers, no passing cars, just pine trees and the smell of cold dirt. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and dry air. The floorboards had scratches across them. The windows had thin curtains that barely covered the glass. There was a fireplace made of stone, and next to it sat a rusted metal bucket filled with chopped logs. I dropped my bag near the table and looked around. Everything seemed normal enough, but something about the silence felt heavy, like it was watching me. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle in. Outside, the sky was already dimming, turning from pale blue to a darker shade that made the tree line look even sharper. I noticed something odd when I stepped onto the back porch. The door frame had small dents in the wood, like someone had hit it hard with something metal. The owner never mentioned any repairs. I ran my fingers over the dents. They weren't old. The wood felt too clean, not worn down by time. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe an animal or old damage from years ago. That night, I heated a small meal on the stove and sat at the table while the wind moved through the trees outside. I could hear branches scraping lightly against the cabin walls. The sound made me tense even though I tried to ignore it. I slept early because the darkness around the cabin felt thicker than usual. I kept a small battery lamp on beside the bed, even though I normally don't sleep with lights. Around midnight, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was at first, but the darkness felt different. I could hear something outside. It wasn't the wind. It was slow, steady, like weight moving across the porch boards. I stayed still in bed, breathing as quietly as I could. The heater wasn't running. The cabin felt cold. The sound continued, soft creaks in a pattern that didn't match the wind. Someone was walking. I didn't look out the window. I just kept listening. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I waited for a long time, lying completely still until my muscles started to ache. Eventually, I forced myself to sleep again, but it was light and scattered. The next morning, I stepped outside to check the porch. I didn't see footprints at first, but then I noticed the wood dust near the steps. It was disturbed, like someone had brushed against it. I walked around the cabin, and when I reached the back porch, I froze. The back door frame now had new scratches near the handle. Fresh ones. The wood edges still looked light, not darkened by weather. My chest felt tight. The owner hadn't said anything about break-ins or problems. Maybe I was overthinking, but the marks were too fresh to ignore. I checked the lock twice before going back inside. By late afternoon, the sky turned gray, and the temperature dropped even more. I kept pacing inside the cabin because every now and then I thought I heard something outside, a quick step or the sound of something brushing the wall. I told myself it was just the trees shifting in the cold. But when the sun fully dropped, the noises became sharper. Around 8 p.m., something hit the back of the cabin. Not hard enough to break anything, but hard enough for me to feel it through the floor. My stomach dropped. I stood near the fireplace, staring at the back door like it might open on its own. The cabin wasn't big, so every sound felt close. I turned off all the lights except the lamp near the front door. I moved a chair quietly and sat where I could see most of the windows. My hands were shaking even though the room was warm. Hours passed slowly. The only thing I heard was my own breathing and the low hum of the fridge. Then, sometime after 11, the noise returned. This time it came from the side of the cabin, the wall near the kitchen. A short scrape, then another. Someone was checking the outer wall again. I stood up slowly, my legs weak. I didn't have a gun or anything strong. The only thing near me was a fire poker. I grabbed it tight. I turned off the last lamp. I waited in the dark, barely breathing. The sound moved, shifting from the kitchen wall to the back porch again. A soft knock sounded against the wood, not like someone politely knocking. It was slow, testing, like they wanted to see how strong the door was. The back door rattled. My heart felt like it stopped. I stepped back into the main room and kept the fire poker close to my chest. The rattling stopped after a few seconds, but I stayed frozen, listening for another sound. For maybe 10 minutes, there was nothing. Then the footsteps moved away from the porch. Slow, heavy, and then silence. I didn't sleep at all. When morning finally came, I stepped outside again, afraid of what I'd see. The dirt around the porch showed faint footprints wide, deep ones from heavy boots. They circled the cabin in uneven paths. Someone had walked around it several times. But what made my stomach twist was the back door. The lock had fresh marks around the metal, like someone tried to pry it open with a tool. They hadn't succeeded, but they were close. I packed everything in under 10 minutes. I didn't even bother cleaning up the cabin. When I drove down the mountain road, my hands were still shaking on the wheel. When I reached the main road, I stopped at a gas station. Inside, I saw a local newspaper sitting near the counter. The headline on the bottom corner caught my eye. Authorities search for man involved in break-in near Mountain Trail. The location listed was only 15 minutes from the cabin. That explained everything. The dents, the footsteps, the scraping, the attempts at the door. Nothing supernatural, nothing strange. Just a real person wandering around the woods, looking for the next place to enter. I realized then how close he had been to getting inside that night. If the lock had been weaker, if he tried harder, if he had better tools, I wouldn't have had time to escape. When I got home, I deleted the cabin owner's number and decided I would never stay alone in a remote place again. I wanted peace and quiet, but I learned something that week. Silence isn't comforting when you're truly alone. It hides sounds you should hear, and it makes danger feel even closer. The ending was simple. I left, I never went back, and I learned that the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. It's the people walking in the dark where no one else can see them, checking windows, testing doors, just waiting for the right moment. That night in the cabin could have ended the wrong way. I'm just lucky it didn't. I drove out to the old cabin in northern Idaho in late October of 2014, a few weeks after my 27th birthday. I had rented the place online because I wanted to be alone for a while and clear my head. The photos showed a small wooden cabin by a lake, with trees on all sides and a narrow dirt road that barely looked wide enough for a truck. It seemed perfect for a quiet week, and I told myself the cold air and long walks would help me forget the pressure of work and everything waiting for me back in the city. The road to the cabin felt more remote than I expected. The dirt path ran between tall pines that blocked most of the sky, and the farther I drove, the fewer tire marks I saw. It felt like no one had come through for months. My phone signal had died almost an hour before I arrived, and the silence inside the car made the whole place feel even more cut off. When I finally reached the cabin, it stood by the edge of the lake, which was flat and dark like a sheet of metal. The air smelled sharp, almost like it came straight from the mountains. Inside, the cabin was simple. One room with a bed in the corner, a small kitchen, a wooden table, and a bathroom that looked like it never had warm water. I dropped my bags by the bed and walked around the place. The wooden floor felt unstable under my boots, and every step made a dry, cracking sound. Still, it felt peaceful. I spent the first hour unpacking, checking the windows, making sure the door lock worked, and trying to get used to the quiet. There wasn't a single other house across the lake or anywhere near. It was just trees, water, and the wind. Later that evening, I walked outside to look around. The sun was already going down, and the sky turned dark orange, then deep blue. The cold crawled through my jacket, and the wind kept pushing dry leaves across the ground. I stood by the lake, breathing in slow, and for a moment I felt calm. But when I looked toward the tree line on the other side, I saw something strange. It looked like someone had walked across the muddy edge of the water earlier. A trail of footprints, long and spaced apart like whoever made them had taken heavy steps. They led into the trees and disappeared. I tried to tell myself they were old prints, maybe from a fisherman or a hunter, but they looked fresh. Too fresh. The edges weren't softened by rain or wind. I checked the ground around the cabin too, and even though the soil was soft, I didn't see any footprints there except my own. That bothered me. If someone had come close enough to walk by the lake, why weren't there any marks near the cabin? I went back inside and tried to relax. I cooked a simple meal, ate by the table, and listened to the cabin creak every time the wind hit it. The temperature dropped fast, and I could see my breath near the window. I sat on the bed and tried to read a book I brought, but I couldn't stay focused. I kept thinking about the prince. That night, lying in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin wasn't as empty as it looked from the outside. I kept hearing small sounds, like something brushing lightly against the wood. I told myself it was just branches or animals moving around, but every few minutes the noise came back, slow, soft, and close. I hardly slept, and when morning came, I stepped outside to check the yard. That's when my heart dropped. There were new footprints in the dirt. Not animal prints, human prints. They were right in front of the door, only a few feet away from where I slept. They weren't there the night before. I checked at least 3 times before going inside. These were fresh, deep, and facing the door like someone had stood there for a long time. That morning air felt colder than anything I had felt the day before. I followed the prints slowly, even though I didn't want to. They went toward the trees again, but this time they weren't alone. There was a second set, smaller, as if someone had come from the woods to meet the person standing outside my door. Both sets went deeper into the trees, and after about 30 feet, they stopped. Not faded, stopped, like the people who made them lifted their feet and walked on dry leaves without disturbing anything. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have a phone signal, and the nearest town was miles away. I tried to convince myself it was nothing serious, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I went back to the cabin, locked the door, and spent most of the day inside. By late afternoon, I forced myself to check around again because I couldn't sit still. That's when I found something new. Behind the cabin, near the back window, the dirt looked disturbed. Someone had knelt there. The shape was clear, knees pressed deep into the soil, like they had bent down and stayed still. My chest tightened. The back window was where the bed was. Someone had knelt under my window while I was inside trying to sleep the night before. The rest of the day felt endless. Every sound outside made me flinch. Every shadow through the window made my stomach tighten. The sun went down early, and darkness filled the cabin. I didn't turn on the lights. I dragged the small wooden table against the door and sat on the floor with my back against the wall, listening. I didn't sleep at all. Around midnight, something touched the cabin wall. A slow, dragging sound, like fingers running across wood. Then another sound from the back, like someone brushing past the corner. I stayed completely still. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. The dragging sound came again, then stopped. I stayed frozen like that until the sky outside turned gray and the first light came. When I finally went outside, I saw new prints again. This time they circled the cabin not once, but several times. Deep steps, slow and steady, like someone had walked around it for hours, staying close to the walls. That was the moment I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything in less than 5 minutes, threw it in the truck, and didn't even check the cabin again. I drove down the dirt road so fast the gravel hit the sides like hail. I didn't breathe normally until I reached the highway. Even now, years later, I think about those prints. Whoever made them never tried to break in. They never left a sign of who they were. They just stood outside, circling, watching. And the thought that bothers me most is that they probably knew I was alone long before I knew someone else was out there in the woods with me. I never went back, and I never rented another cabin again. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I imagine those slow footsteps in the dirt, moving in circles around some dark, quiet place. And even though I left that cabin behind, I still feel, in some corner of my mind, that the person who made those prints never stopped walking. I remember the summer of 2016 like it was yesterday, even though it feels like a lifetime ago. I was 24, fresh out of college, and desperate for some kind of escape from the city. I had been working a dull, soul-draining desk job in Seattle, staring at spreadsheets and listening to the hum of fluorescent lights for 12 hours a day. I needed air, isolation, a sense of something real. That's how I ended up driving 3 hours into the Cascades to a tiny, forgotten cabin listed online as perfect for solitude and reflection. The pictures were simple. A rustic wooden cabin tucked against a thick forest, with a small lake visible in the distance. The description promised quiet, no neighbors for miles, and a firewood stash. Sounded perfect. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was how quiet it really was. Not just no traffic quiet, but a heavy, pressing silence that seemed to press down on the trees and the mossy ground. I parked my car on the rutted dirt path and unloaded my bag. The cabin looked smaller in person than in the pictures, more like a single-room shack than anything else, but it had a certain charm. Inside, the smell of damp wood and old pine greeted me, along with a thick layer of dust covering the table and the chairs. I didn't mind. I was alone, and that was what I wanted. I spent the first day exploring the surrounding area. There was a narrow trail behind the cabin that wound through the trees and ended at the lake. The water was still and dark, the kind of lake that made you think twice about what might be lurking just below the surface. I didn't swim, just walked along the edge, skipping stones and listening to the distant calls of birds. As the sun set, the forest seemed to grow heavier, darker, almost like it was settling around me. I returned to the cabin and started a fire in the small stone fireplace, eating a cold sandwich and staring at the flames. That night was the first time I noticed how isolated I really was. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a strange rustling outside. At first, I thought it was the wind moving through the branches, but the sound was too deliberate, too low. It wasn't like leaves brushing together, it was heavier, like someone stepping on dry twigs. I froze, straining my ears. The cabin was silent again, except for that careful, slow movement outside. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, a deer, or maybe a raccoon, but the sound felt human. My heart started pounding. I thought about calling 911, but my phone barely had a signal, and I didn't want to step outside to check. I stayed under the thin cabin blanket, holding a kitchen knife, listening until the noises faded. I eventually fell asleep, but not without the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I explored more. The rustling from the night before had shaken me, but the fresh air and sunlight helped. I collected firewood, checked the water in the lake, and scouted the surrounding trees for any signs of other people. There were none. The only thing I found were faint footprints in the mud near the back of the cabin. They looked recent but irregular, like whoever made them had been stumbling or limping. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I even told myself I had imagined the sounds last night. But deep down, I knew someone had been nearby. By the second night, the sense of unease had grown. Every sound, every snap of a branch, every groan of the wooden floor felt amplified. I stayed awake longer, lighting candles and pacing the cabin. Around midnight, I heard the rustling again, closer this time. It was like someone moving around the edge of the cabin, careful but deliberate. My instincts screamed at me to hide or run, but I didn't know where to go. The nearest road was miles away, and the forest was dense. I climbed onto the small loft bed, holding the knife close, and tried to make myself as small as possible. The noises lasted for what felt like hours. Then, just as abruptly as they had started, they stopped. The third day, I knew I couldn't stay passive. I had to find out what was going on. I spent the daylight hours checking the perimeter of the cabin. That's when I saw the signs. A small patch of disturbed ground near the lake, something half buried under leaves. I pulled away the debris and found a makeshift fire pit, freshly extinguished. There were scraps of food, an old bottle, and footprints leading into the trees. Someone had been living nearby or at least camping, and they hadn't been friendly. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I realized I needed to leave, but I also needed to make sure I could get back safely. That night, I packed my bag quietly. I made sure to leave the fire pit untouched so whoever had been watching wouldn't realize I was leaving immediately. Then I slipped out the door, careful to make no noise. The forest was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I followed the trail I had walked before, hoping it led to the road. Every crack of a branch underfoot made me jump. Every rustle of leaves had me ducking behind trees. I moved slowly but deliberately. Hours later, I finally saw the faint glimmer of headlights. I stumbled onto the dirt road and flagged down a passing car. The driver, a local, gave me a lift back to town. I told him I'd had enough of the wilderness for a while. When I returned to the city, I called the property owner to explain why I hadn't stayed. They seemed surprised but understood, mentioning that the area was known for occasional trespassers and people camping illegally. That was it. No confrontation, no arrests, no dramatic chase scenes, just a cold realization that the forest was home to others. And sometimes, solitude comes at a risk. I never returned to that cabin, and I never sought isolation quite like that again. But the memory lingers. The sound of footsteps in the night, the shadowed trees, the feeling of being utterly alone and watched. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also a reminder that real danger doesn't need to be supernatural, it just needs someone else breathing the same quiet air as you, unseen and unpredictable. I rented a small cabin near the Bitter Lake Preserve in northern Minnesota in the fall of 2019, a few weeks after I turned 30. I had been burned out from work and wanted a place where I could hear my own breathing again. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far off a gravel road that barely appeared on maps. The rental website made it look peaceful, and the host claimed it was perfect for people who needed silence and isolation. At the time, that sounded exactly like what I wanted. I didn't think much about how isolation works both ways. When something goes wrong, there is nowhere to go. The first day felt calm. The air smelled like wet pine and cold dirt, the kind that clings to your clothes even after you go inside. The cabin was small but warm, with a single room that held a bed, a table, a wood-burning stove, and a tiny kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. There was no cell signal and no Wi-Fi. The host had warned me about that ahead of time, so I had downloaded a few movies to watch before going to sleep. The woods around the cabin were thick and old. The kind of old that makes you feel like you're being watched even when you know logically that you aren't. Fallen branches snapped under my boots when I walked around the property that afternoon. Everything felt still, almost too still, like the entire forest had paused to examine me. That night I had trouble sleeping. The wind pushed against the cabin walls, and every few minutes something tapped lightly against the side of the building. It was probably just loose branches, but every sound felt sharper because I was alone. Around 2 a.m., I heard what I thought was movement outside, slow footsteps on the leaves. I convinced myself it was just a deer and rolled over until I eventually drifted into a light sleep. The next morning, I found something strange behind the cabin. There were footprints in the soft mud. They looked fresh, not yet affected by sunlight or wind. They weren't boot prints like mine, just worn-down soles that could have belonged to almost anyone. They led from the tree line straight toward the back of the cabin and stopped right under the window near the bed. That shook me more than I wanted to admit. I had been lying right on the other side of that window, alone, half asleep, thinking it was only branches hitting the wall. I tried to calm myself by imagining someone out hiking, maybe passing through the area early in the morning. But the prints were too deliberate. They didn't come from the direction of any trail. They came from the deeper part of the woods, the part nobody really visits. I told myself I'd sweep the area around the cabin later and moved on with my day. But as the hours passed, I noticed more things. Small things at first. A few scratches on the side of the shed that weren't there before. A rusty garden shovel leaning in a different direction. A wet boot print near the cabin door even though I knew I hadn't stepped there. Each thing by itself felt easy to explain away, but together they formed a picture I didn't want to look at too closely. That second night, the footsteps returned, but this time they were slower, heavier, more confident. I felt cold sweat on my neck as I lay still in bed, listening to the soft crunch of leaves outside the window. There was a long pause after the footsteps stopped. I could hear my heartbeat shaking through my ribs. After a few seconds, something brushed against the wall again, but the sound was different from the night before. Not a branch, more like the drag of a sleeve or the side of a jacket. I didn't move until sunrise. I forced myself to walk outside when the light came. My hands were shaking as I circled the cabin. The footprints were back, deeper this time. There were more of them too, pacing in small circles, as if someone had stood there for a long time. I followed the tracks toward the trees until they blended into the forest floor. Whoever had been walking around knew how to move quietly, and that fact made my stomach twist. I packed my belongings into my duffel bag that afternoon. I told myself I would leave first thing in the morning, even if that meant breaking the rental agreement. I started stacking firewood inside since the temperature had dropped, and while I reached for a log near the bottom of the pile, I noticed something wedged between two pieces. It was a small tin lid from a food can, bent sharply in the middle. Someone had placed it there. I hadn't eaten anything from a can since I arrived. My hands were trembling by then. The sun was lowering behind the trees, and the shadows stretched across the yard in long, dark lines. The air suddenly felt colder, as if someone had opened a door behind me, but there was nobody there. That night, I barricaded the door using the table and stacked firewood near the stove. I kept the lights low, trying to listen for anything outside. Around midnight, the footsteps came again, slower than before. Each step felt like it lasted an hour. Then came the tapping on the wall, steady and patient. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, unable to move. The air tasted like metal. I felt the vibration of each knock through the wooden boards of the cabin. After a few minutes, the tapping stopped. Then I heard the soft sound of the door handle shifting. Not turning, just testing. A gentle metal click. Then another. The sound went on for nearly 10 minutes. I stayed frozen. Eventually, the noises faded. The forest fell silent again. I didn't sleep at all. When the first light hit the cabin, I removed the table, grabbed my bag, and left without cleaning or checking anything else. The woods felt heavier that morning. Nothing moved, not even the wind. I walked fast down the long dirt path toward the gravel road, my eyes scanning the tree line the entire time. When I reached my car, I noticed something that made my stomach twist again. More footprints. They circled the car and then stopped right at the driver's side door. Someone had been waiting there at some point, maybe the night before, maybe earlier. I didn't care to figure out when. I got in, locked the doors, and drove until the cabin was a distant, shrinking memory. Later that week, after I returned home, I received a message from the rental host saying there had been reports of a man seen wandering the deeper parts of the preserve. He had been living in the woods for a long time, avoiding people, breaking into sheds for supplies, sometimes approaching cabins at night. They didn't know how dangerous he was, They only said he knew the forest better than anyone else and rarely spoke. That explained all the footprints, all the scratches, all the tapping on the walls in the middle of the night. He had been watching me from the trees, standing inches from my window while I slept, testing the door while I lay frozen in the dark, hoping the flimsy lock would be enough. And the thought that haunts me the most is not what he did, but what he decided not to do. He stayed outside because he chose to, not because anything stopped him. That is the part that still keeps me awake some nights, long after the cabin is gone from my life. The simple fact that someone stood that close to me, in the quiet dark woods of Minnesota, and I never even heard him breathe. I drove up to the cabin in early November of 2019, a time when the mountains in northern Colorado were already cold enough to sting my skin but not yet buried in snow. I had rented the place for a week because I wanted to get away from the noise of my life. I was 31 then, tired from work, tired from people, tired from my routine. A friend had told me about this quiet area near an old Forest Service trail, close enough to a lake but far enough from town that the only sounds at night would be the wind and the trees knocking against each other. I thought it would be exactly what I needed. The cabin looked simple when I arrived: dark wood boards, a metal roof that looked newer than the rest of the place, one window in front, another at the side, and a thin porch that had a railing someone had tried to fix but abandoned halfway through. There were patches of old paint on the boards, like someone had once planned to repaint the whole thing and then forgot about it for years. I stepped out of my car, stretched my back, and breathed in the cold air. It smelled of pine, dirt, and old leaves. It felt peaceful at that moment, the kind of peace that makes your shoulders drop. Inside, the cabin was small. One main room, a narrow hallway, and a single bedroom in the back. The bathroom was barely big enough for a shower. A wood stove sat in the corner, and next to it was a stack of chopped logs. Everything looked old but clean enough. The floors creaked with every step I took, but I didn't think much of it. Old cabins creak. On the first night, nothing strange happened. I cooked canned soup, unpacked my things, walked around the cabin to get a feel for it, and went to bed early. I slept well, even better than I had slept in months. The second night was when things changed. It started with a sound I didn't expect, not a supernatural sound. Nothing unreal, just a noise that didn't fit. It was past midnight when I woke up for no reason. My body didn't feel rested or relaxed. It felt alert. I stared at the ceiling for a moment before I realized what had pulled me out of sleep. It was a slow, steady crunch outside, like someone stepping on old leaves or small gravel. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably an animal. Deer were common in the area, and raccoons could be loud. I lay still, hoping the noise would fade. Instead, it grew more distinct. A step, then a pause. Another step, another pause. Not fast, not panicked, not random like an animal moving around. It was steady, paced, almost deliberate. I forced myself to sit up. The room was cold. The air felt sharper than before, and I could see my breath faintly rising in front of me, even though the wood stove in the main room still held some heat. I waited, listening. The steps moved along the side of the cabin and then stopped near the window by the bedroom. The quiet that followed felt heavier than sound. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a moment. I just stared toward the window, even though the curtains were drawn. Eventually, the steps faded. They didn't run off. They simply moved away, growing softer until they were gone completely. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in bed with my back against the wall until the weak early morning light reached through the curtains. The next day, I tried to make sense of it. I walked around the cabin outside, but the ground was covered in layers of dry pine needles and soft dirt. Any footprints would have blended into the texture. I tried to convince myself it must have been an animal walking unusually slow, or maybe two animals stepping in a pattern that made it sound like footsteps. My mind didn't buy it, but I told myself the explanation enough times that it stopped bothering me for a few hours. That night, I kept the lamps on. I tried reading a book, but I kept losing focus. Every sound, the wind, the branches, the shifting boards, made me tense. I tried telling myself I was being dramatic. At around 1 in the morning, I heard it again. This time it started at the porch. The wood groaned under weight. Not heavy weight, just human weight. The kind of pressure you feel when someone steps cautiously. My chest tightened. I sat upright in bed again, staring at the door even though I knew I couldn't see anything from where I was. The steps moved away from the porch and circled the cabin slowly, exactly like the night before. I realized then that the pattern wasn't random. Whoever or whatever was outside was moving with intention. They knew where the windows were. They paused at each one. I felt trapped, like the walls were shrinking. My phone had no signal out here. There was no Wi-Fi, no neighbors, no passing cars. Just me, the cabin, and the slow, steady movement outside. Again, eventually, the steps faded and silence returned. I lay awake, trying to breathe normally. My heart felt too fast, like it was trying to outrun the reality I was stuck in. Morning couldn't come soon enough. I walked outside again and checked every corner of the cabin. The air was colder now, and the wind carried a sharp bite. I noticed something I hadn't seen before: a mark near the porch railing. It looked like a boot scuff, the kind you leave when your foot drags a little. I told myself it might have been there before I arrived, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I considered leaving right then, but I didn't want to feel like I had run away from nothing. I wanted a logical explanation. I wanted to feel like an adult who could handle a few scary nights alone. I told myself I would stay one more night, but that would be it. That final night was the worst. It was colder than before. The cabin felt even smaller, as if the walls were slowly leaning in. I sat at the table with all the lights on and my jacket still on my shoulders because the wood stove couldn't push away all the cold that crept in through the old boards. The footsteps didn't wait until midnight this time. They started at around 11. First a soft shift of weight on the porch boards, then a slow slide like a boot dragging, then the steps again. But something changed this time. They didn't circle the cabin. They stayed near the door. I could hear the boards bending under whoever was standing there. Standing still, listening, waiting. Every hair on my arms lifted. The air felt thick, like I was breathing through fabric. I sat completely still at the table, afraid to even blink. Minutes passed long, heavy minutes where nothing changed. The weight remained on the porch, unmoving. I felt certain that whoever was out there knew exactly where I was standing inside the cabin. I felt it in the same way you can feel eyes on you even when you can't see them. Then, slowly, the weight shifted again. Steps moved away from the door, down the porch, and into the trees. They didn't return. I didn't go to bed that night. I packed my things, waited for the first hint of morning light, and walked out to my car with my keys already in my hand. The cold air cut at my skin, and the forest around me felt too quiet, like the trees were holding their breath. Before I got in the car, I looked at the porch one last time. That's when I saw it clearly in the morning light, a fresh boot print in the thin frost that formed overnight. Faced the door. It was large, maybe size 11 or 12, and it wasn't mine. I didn't stay long enough to look for more. I left the cabin behind and drove down the dirt road faster than I probably should have. My hands shook on the wheel until I reached the main highway. I never went back to that place, and I never tried to find out who had been outside on those nights. I don't think it would have made me feel better to know. Sometimes the most frightening things are the ones that have real explanations, the ones tied to real people, living people, people who walk slowly around cabins in the middle of the night for reasons you will never understand. And that's the part that still stays with me. Not the cabin, not the footsteps, not the cold. What stays with me is knowing that someone was out there, awake, aware, and waiting in the dark while I slept only a few feet away. I left that place behind, but the fear of those footsteps has never really left me. I drove to the cabin in late October of 2019, thinking the cold air and open space in the northern Colorado mountains would help me finish the project I had been putting off for months. The cabin belonged to a distant relative who said I could use it whenever I wanted. It wasn't big, just a single-level wooden structure sitting in a clearing surrounded by tall, thin pines that seemed to lean toward the cabin like they were curious about whoever stayed inside. The dirt road leading up to it was uneven and scattered with stones that knocked against the bottom of my old car. The sky looked like a dull sheet of metal, heavy and low. There was no snow yet, but the ground felt hard under my boots, as if the earth had already started freezing from the inside out. When I first opened the door to the cabin, the smell of old wood and dust rushed out. It wasn't dirty, just unused for months. Inside, the cabin had a small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a living area with a wood stove. I unpacked my bag, set my laptop on the table, and tried to settle in. The first few hours were normal, quiet. Too quiet, actually. I could hear my own breathing, the ticking sound of cooling metal on the stove, the faint rustle of the pines outside. For a while, that quiet helped. I worked more in one afternoon than I had in 2 weeks. But near sunset, something started to feel off. I stepped outside to bring in more firewood, and that's when I noticed footprints behind the cabin. Not mine. These prints were older, softened around the edges, but still clear enough to show a shape. They were spaced unevenly, like whoever made them was either limping or carrying something heavy. They stopped near the back window, the one that faced the woods. At first I thought maybe an animal had passed close by, but these were human. I tried to convince myself they were from months ago, maybe from someone who stayed here last. Still, I found myself looking deeper into the woods, feeling like the trees were hiding something I couldn't see. That night, I kept the fire burning longer than I needed to. I didn't want the inside of the cabin to feel dark. The wind picked up around midnight, tapping branches against the walls. It wasn't loud, but it kept me awake enough to hear things I didn't want to notice. Light scuffs outside, a faint crunch of dry leaves, the kind of small sounds that shouldn't bother someone in a remote cabin but somehow felt too deliberate. I barely slept 3 hours. The next morning, I stepped outside again, and this time the footprints were new. I could see the difference easily. The edges were sharp, crisp, made after the frost that formed overnight. They circled the cabin in an uneven path, going from window to window, as if someone had walked around checking inside. There were no tire tracks, no prints leading far enough away to show the direction they came from. Just the footprints around the cabin, like the person disappeared back into the trees. I felt a cold, slow pressure in the center of my chest. I went back inside and locked the door, even though it barely helped. The locks on that old cabin felt like they could be forced open with a shoulder hit. I tried to work again, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. The glass looked darker than before, not because of the weather, but because I kept imagining someone standing just out of sight, watching from the tree line. Around late afternoon, I noticed something else. The firewood stack behind the cabin had been shifted. I knew how I left it the day before, neat, straight rows. But now the top pieces were turned at odd angles, like someone had dug through them. My hands were shaking when I picked one up. It wasn't a raccoon or some other animal. The pieces were too heavy for that, and they had been lifted, not knocked over. By the third night, I couldn't rest at all. Every sound made me freeze. I heard slow steps outside sometime after 2 in the morning. Not fast, not sneaky, just slow, steady steps on the dry ground. They came from the back of the cabin and moved along the side where the bedroom wall was. I felt the thin wooden structure around me like it was breathing. I stayed completely still on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to those steps until they faded again. When the sun finally came up, I went outside immediately. The footprints were everywhere, fresh ones, overlapping the old ones. They were so close to the walls that whoever made them must have been leaning in, listening. I checked the firewood again, and this time I found something else, an empty food wrapper tucked between the logs. Not mine. I didn't bring anything like it. That was when everything inside me told me I shouldn't stay another night. I packed my things fast. The cold air felt sharper that morning, almost metallic in my mouth as I breathed. Before getting into my car, I looked at the tree line again. The woods stood still, but the silence felt heavy, like it was waiting for something to move. As I pulled away down the dirt path, I looked in the rearview mirror, just once, and I saw a figure standing near the corner of the cabin. Not close enough for me to make out a face, but close enough that I knew they had been there the entire time, waiting for another night, maybe another chance to get even closer. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway. Only then did I allow myself to breathe without shaking. Later that week, I told my relative about the cabin. He didn't go up there often, but he agreed to check. When he got there, he called me back. He said the door was open. Not broken, just open. Inside, the mattress was pulled halfway off the bed, as if someone had been lying under it or rummaging through it. The firewood behind the cabin was scattered on the ground, and he found fresh footprints leading into the woods. He asked if I wanted to use the cabin again. I said no, not now, not ever. And the part that stays with me the most is the simple, solid truth I keep coming back to. There were no ghosts, no creatures, nothing supernatural hiding in those trees. Just a real person who lived there, moved around the cabin at night, watched from the dark edges of the woods, and waited for the right moment. And I left before that moment came. I had been looking for a quiet place to clear my head, somewhere far away from the noise of the city and the constant pressure that had been building on my shoulders for months. When a coworker mentioned an old cabin he once rented deep in the forests of northern Colorado, it sounded perfect. I booked it without thinking twice. I wanted silence, cold air, and a place where nobody would bother me. I had no idea how much the silence would get to me once I was actually out there. It was early October of 2019 when I drove up the long dirt road that led to the property. The road climbed slowly through thick pine trees that looked all the same, and after a few miles I couldn't even remember the last time I saw another car or a house. The cabin looked smaller than I expected when I finally reached it, sitting alone in a small clearing. It had dark wood walls, a metal roof that looked rusty around the edges, and a small porch that leaned slightly to the left. The place looked old, but that was what I wanted. Something raw and quiet. Inside, everything was simple. A single bedroom with a narrow bed, a kitchen with old appliances, a bathroom with a small water heater that rattled when it turned on, and a main room with a wood stove and almost no furniture. The air smelled like dust and dry wood that had been sitting untouched for too long. I dropped my bags on the floor and told myself I liked the emptiness. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, made a simple meal, explored the clearing around the cabin, and took short walks on the narrow trails behind the property. The forest felt peaceful at first. Tall, dark pines stood so close together that hardly any sunlight reached the ground. Every step I took made the dry needles crunch under my boots. It was strangely calming, but at the same time, the thick silence pressed against my ears. I realized quickly that the forest was almost too quiet. I rarely heard birds, and even the wind seemed to avoid this place. By the second night, I started noticing things that made me uneasy. Small things at first. The cabin door felt slightly open when I woke up from a nap, even though I was sure I had shut it tightly earlier. The chair near the window seemed to be at a different angle when I walked inside after stepping out for firewood. I told myself I just didn't remember things correctly, or maybe the uneven floor made the chair slide a bit. I tried not to overthink any of it. Later that night, as I sat near the wood stove, I heard something moving outside. It wasn't loud, just a slow, dragging sound against the dirt or the wooden porch. I froze, waiting for it to happen again, but the sound stopped. I kept staring at the window even though I couldn't see anything but darkness. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon, but the dragging sound had felt too slow, too heavy. I didn't sleep very well that night. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around the cabin. That was when I noticed footprints in the soft dirt near the porch. Not paw prints, actual footprints. Bare feet. The tracks were smeared and uneven, as if the person had been limping or dragging one leg. The prints came from the trees, circled around the cabin, and disappeared again into the forest on the other side. My stomach tightened when I saw them. I had seen no signs of hikers or campers anywhere nearby. The nearest town was almost 40 miles away. There was no reason for someone to be walking out here barefoot. I tried to convince myself that maybe the prints were old and had just been revealed by the wind or shifting dirt. But I knew they weren't. They were too clear, too deep. I thought about leaving, but I had already paid for the place, and I didn't want to run away just because I got spooked. I tried to ignore the tracks and went about my day, hiking deeper into the woods and taking photos of small streams, fallen trees, and a broken hunting stand I found leaning against a thick pine. Still, the whole time I felt watched. Whenever I stopped walking, the forest felt like it held its breath. By evening, the wind picked up, shaking the trees and making the cabin creak every few seconds. I brought more firewood inside and locked the door. I checked the windows twice, even though the locks were flimsy and wouldn't stop anyone who really wanted to get inside. I sat on the bed for a long time, listening to the wind and trying to calm myself. Around midnight, I heard the dragging sound again. This time it was closer, right outside the wall behind the bed. The cabin was so old that I could feel vibrations through the floorboards as if someone was moving slowly along the outer wall. My throat felt tight, and I forced myself not to breathe too loudly. I could hear leaves being crushed under heavy steps, and then a soft thump, like someone leaning against the wood. I stayed completely still until the sound slowly moved away and faded into the wind. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, the temperature had dropped, and thin frost covered the porch. I stepped outside carefully, scanning the clearing. More footprints, fresh ones. They circled the cabin again and then stopped near the bedroom window. My chest felt cold as I realized whoever had been out here had stood right next to where I had been lying awake a few hours earlier. That was enough for me. I packed my things fast and shoved everything into the car without caring about the order. My hands shook so badly that I dropped my keys twice before starting the engine. As I pulled away, I looked into the trees one last time. The forest looked still and empty, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger the farther I drove down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, and even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone stepping out of the trees. When I finally reached town, I parked near a gas station and just sat in the car with my hands on the wheel, trying to slow my breathing. The quiet cabin that I had wanted so badly had turned into one of the worst nights of my life. I never went back. I didn't contact the owner. I didn't ask for a refund. I couldn't bring myself to look at photos of the trip for weeks. Even now, when I think about it, I try not to imagine who was out there walking barefoot through the cold forest, circling the cabin again and again, dragging their foot as they moved. I tell myself it was probably just someone lost or unstable, nothing supernatural or impossible. Something real, something human. That's what makes it worse.